Good morning, good evening, good night, wherever you're watching this transmission. It is I, Mike Martins, and I'm on the phone with our man, Andrew Baker, an economist, understands economy, knows the ins and outs of economy, has been studying economy most of his life. He started counting at the age of 1. Andrew, how you doing?
Yeah, I'm good. How are you, Mike?
I'm doing fantastic. Okay, what's on your mind? What were you telling me until I said hold it for the show?
So I was talking about how the government here is going to announce a budget surplus, but the problem is they're announcing a budget surplus into global market weakness. So they they don't really understand. I don't really understand how they're going to go about explaining to the public how we end up in recession just after getting a budget surplus, because most people don't know the difference between the different types of debt that we have in the country.
So why don't you
So
explain the types of debt that are right now in the country?
So, like every country has public debt, which is the government debt. You have private debt, which is either it's broken up into it's broken up into businesses and households.
Right.
But in Australia, we have our households have got 3 times the amount of debt as what our government does. So whenever I hear people talking about a budget surplus or a budget deficit, I don't think they really understand the difference between a government budget and a household budget, because the government can run a deficit, whereas if a household runs a deficit, they end up losing their house. Right.
Right. So when people with the house lose the house, and people that are stuck or in a bind, they sell off assets to put themselves
Yeah,
back in
exactly.
line.
Yeah,
But when the
yeah.
government has a problem, they just print off money.
Well, they issue bonds or they print money. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. All right. Continue.
So my concern is that there's going to be so much of a focus on running a budget surplus at a time where the credit in the private sector is shrinking. So the household debt has been shrinking probably for the last 6 months or so, and the private sector credit has been shrinking as well. So if the government's going to run a surplus, it means they're shrinking the credit supply as well. And I can't fathom that they're going to be able to do that without there being either a recession or 1 quarter of negative GDP growth, or something along those lines. Like there'll be either something along those lines, or there'll be a bunch of jobs that get lost, and then that's the final outcome afterwards as well. Because fundamentally, how do you get a job without taking out a loan? Like how do you hire new employees? You either have to have the savings to do it, which we don't have, or you have to take out a loan.
Right. Okay.
Right?
Could they combat this with maybe some quantitative easing?
Like they can, but what's going to happen here is that we haven't raised rates at all in this market cycle. The
Right. That's
entire time
correct.
that they've been cut. Well, Canada was able to do that. The US has done it a bunch of times. I think Australia is more in the Europe situation than what they are in the North America situation, which is pretty scary, really.
It,
Um,
Australia is looking more and more like more of a Japanese-ish type of an economy.
yeah, I think the only saving grace we have is the fact that we've had a fairly large amount of immigration to kind of offset the fact that our there's less and less demand in our economy. Like by bringing in new people, we've been able to kind of offset that a little bit, but I don't know how long they're going to keep being able to do that before it becomes a social issue where people really resent one another. Like I noticed there's a big um, class divide between generations. Like people that are under the age of about 40 really resent older people in our country now, which is like it's not how it should be. But by the same token, it's just it's very difficult to get by if you're not well off or you haven't inherited a lot of money.
There's a huge divide between the millennials and the boomers right now, and
Definitely, yeah,
so there's a huge the millennials are blaming the boomers, and the boomers are blaming the millennials, and it's a back and forth a dispute of them not retiring early enough and not giving up jobs and blah blah blah. How could a boomer give up a job when if they lose their job, they're gonna, because a lot of these boomers are going into retirement with mortgages.
yeah. Well, that's part of the problem. I think part of the problem as well is that a lot of the boomers are taking on too much debt, and then to service their debt, they're staying in work longer than what they should be.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of that is greed, and part of it is fear for their retirement, which is understandable. But I think there's also a question of how is our generation ever going to be able to service um, the cost of living of older people once they retire? Because there's not enough of us to make up for the fact that once the baby boomers retire, like how do we support them? Like
No.
we're getting taxed to service their retirement, basically.
Oh yeah. If this
All
if
that's based on the way that the government has our fiscal policy set. Like there are other ways of doing it, but I just don't think that anyone really wants to have that conversation.
Well, back in the 60s and 70s, they had this conveyor belt theory where for every boomer that retires, I think it was in the year 1999, by 1999 when they retire, there should be two jobs opening up for, well, they weren't called millennials back in the 60s, but they predicted that in the 1960s, by 1999, for every boomer that retires, basically there'll be two jobs available for every millennial, and they were afraid that there wouldn't be enough population to fill in these job positions, but it's not looking like that at all.
No, I think part of the problem is that they've used a bunch of extrapolation bias and assumed that productivity was going to grow at the rate that it was growing for
Right.
the entire period of time,
Right.
which is not what happened. Like pretty much ever since I would say about 1995 or so, there's been a massive shift towards financial engineering in a bunch of these companies. So instead of doing things that are actually adding to productivity, they'll do a bunch of financial engineering that makes the company look like they're doing a bunch of good things.
Like stock buybacks.
Well, exactly. Yeah. Those sorts of things that make companies look viable. But really, what they're doing is just delaying the day of reckoning, where because there hasn't been any improvement in the company. And I'm not saying this of every company. I'm saying this of legacy companies that do it to just increase their retirement bonus or the amount of money that they retire on. It's not really adding anything for the next generation to kind of step in and improve, because there's nothing like because if you think about the business model of companies like Facebook, Google, like these large multinational media / social media companies, there is a point at which it's just advertising. Like when you really boil down what their product is, it's advertising. And they put all these fancy labels on what they do, but that's really what it is.
That's exactly what it is. So I got an article open here from a couple of hours ago, and it's pretty good. It's interesting. The Australian dollar is pushing higher as stocks and commodities surge. But I just checked the Australian dollar, closed at 94 cents to the Canadian. It was at 95 a few days ago. It's dropped a cent.
Yeah, I think iron ore has definitely gone up recently.
Yes.
But it's a question of how long is this going to last? Like, is this a temporary blip, or is this something more systemic? Now, I'm not sold that it's systemic. I personally think it's a temporary blip. Like, I'm happy to be proven wrong. In fact, it would be good for the country if I'm proven wrong. But yeah, the proof is in the pudding. And when we start seeing more of the China PMI numbers and things like that, like construction and their manufacturing PMIs, we'll know more so how we're sitting rather than what the commodity price is. Because the commodity price does all these things in between, but as soon as there's a concrete number that comes out, the momentum will either change or it's going to keep going up.
That's right. What about everybody's the dollar, the Australian dollar and economy? It looks like to me that it's rallying off the Chinese export of mass inflation.
Yeah. Well, like we relied heavily on China for a really long period of time. Like, I think government kind of has to realize eventually that we can't keep doing that. Like, it's easy. It's the easy option to do that.
Right. Of course, selling out. Hey, selling out is always the easy option, right?
Yeah. But I don't even think it's selling out, though. It's them going, we're not creative enough to come up with anything else, so we'll just do what is already there and take the credit for that.
Interesting.
Like if they had done nothing, this still would have happened. It wasn't like China said, "Oh, we're going to give you the option of exporting goods to us, and if you don't, we'll go somewhere else." Like, who else even exports the quality of iron ore that Australia does? It doesn't. You can't get it, which is why we basically have monopoly on the supply of that particular resource, and they don't have a choice. Like, they can say, "Oh, we don't want to trade with you," but how are they going to fulfill the demand of the products they're trying to sell in the first place when they need our raw commodities? They can't do it.
Why doesn't Australia get smart and fabricate and engineer and make and export their own from their own?
There's been a massive talk about building like renewable cars and things like that back in Australia, which I think is a sensible option. But there hasn't really been a proper talk about how are we going to transition to large scale energy, like different types of energy rather than just using coal, because eventually there's going to be a bunch of sanctions. Like, regardless of what Australia wants to try and do, you're either going to be part of the Paris Climate Agreement, and everyone will chip in that way, or all the countries that are signatories to that will just put trade embargoes on you until you do sign up. So it's either by choice or by force that's what my opinion is, again, about what's going to happen. So I think we should get smart and do these things and innovate ourselves rather than being forced to later down the line.
Yep. I think if they have a commodity that's very hard to get and no one else could find, or they're being used.
Well, there's a bunch of, like, I'm not even saying that renewable per se is the best method. Like, I think nuclear personally is probably the easiest way to, first of all, fulfill the energy demand and have baseload power, but also to reduce our reliance on foreign commodities. Like, Australia is pretty much the only country in the OECD that has less than 2 months worth of crude oil supplies, and we don't refine onshore. So there's big concerns about energy security in Australia, even though we're like one of the largest exporters of coal in the world.
So here's the thing. I mean, Australia needs to pull up its socks if it wants to look sharp and start refining its own fuels. Start getting some more chemical engineers and getting.
We did, but we shut down the facilities to do so.
Horrible. All private sector jobs, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
That's not good.
But again, like, it's a question of whether or not there's a viable alternative. And, like, I'm no fan of coal, but I also think that you've got to go about it in such a way that there's no in-between time where you've just got nothing in, like, you can't run a country with no energy. Like, in the 21st century, you either have energy or you don't. Like, you're either in the OECD or you're not.
Well, we're going to be entering some energy wars soon, because with China, with China, I call it the Red Dragon when it comes to energy, and they are the #1 energy consuming country on the planet. And they consume more energy than 15, 20, 30, all of Europe and probably half of Russia, or probably all of Europe and Africa put together. But how are they going to do this? How are they going to feed a 1.5 billion or 1.7 billion people? And how are they going to consume?
Well, China's not that large of population. If you combine China and India, you're talking about something like a third of the population. The question is going to be, how do they do it in such a way? Like, China has massive health issues with the amount of energy they consume. Like, almost all of their energy that they were consuming up until, say, about 2015 was coking coal. And because it's so dirty, they ended up with cities that were basically unlivable. Like, there was such a high amount of pollution in the city that they basically had a choice between, do we let our workers get so sick that they're not able to come in, or do we fix this energy problem now? And it's not even a question of pollution or like climate change or anything like that. It's just it's so polluted that we don't really have a choice.
Right. All right, let's move to this here real quick. I want to ask you this. Sydney prices head for a 10% fall. Auction clearance rates remain weak and Sydney prices tracking to be down more than 10% in the year March, while Melbourne is down 9%. So, I mean, Andrew, I'm a very strong believer that only things or the only thing we see on the news or anything that gets brought to us is because it's been leaked. If nothing's been leaked, then we will never know. And I'm a true believer that anything you see on the news is the only I'm not talking about
or it's been heavily PR'd.
Yeah.
One of the two.
Yeah, I'm not talking about car accidents. I'm not talking about like an air show on the news or stuff like that. I'm talking about whenever something like this, economic wise, gets.
Real.
I think it's because
even that, like I watched all the news programs about that particular issue, and the only data source they had was from CoreLogic. And now CoreLogic, if you go through their data, it's very delayed, very, very, very delayed in comparison to what you're seeing. If you will go to an auction week on week, the data doesn't match what they're saying is the case. They're probably 3 months behind. Like at least 3 months behind.
So the problem is they're relaying data. They're making it impossible for people to know what houses sold for. You don't know what's
happening. You're not getting real-time data. That's basically what I'll say about that. But it's very frustrating to me because I actually want to know what's going on now, not 3 months ago.
Right. They're making it like you got to be in some sort of a high-level federal position to know what a damn house sold for.
Yeah.
Who cares?
Yeah, there's not enough transparency. Not enough transparency at all. Very frustrating.
Well, the secrecy thing needs to go away. I mean, we have Better Dwelling. You see me read articles from Better Dwelling, and they're up to date with what's going on, right?
Yeah.
And in Canada, we know what's going on. We know where the numbers are at. We are at numbers from 1980. I have one right now. Better Dwelling. Yeah. Canadian mortgage growth slows to the lowest levels not seen since 1983 recession.
But I think it's also the fact that you have Stephen Punwazi and you also have Steve Soretsky, who are going through data meticulously and putting it out every week. Mm-hmm. We only have one person that's really doing in the sense of it being genuinely done by someone that's not out there to make a profit from the data that they're collecting. There's only really one person that does that in all of Australia.
Mm-hmm.
And even then, it's based on their sample. It's not based on data that's it's not based on the entire set of data. Like if you were to say, 3,000 or 4,000 places sold in a week, he's taking a 50,000 sample nationwide of people that either have sold, want to sell, want to buy, are buyers, like first time. Like it's a very broad spectrum. It's not just people that have bought or sold recently. So it's very, very small samples that we have that are supposed to be representative of what's happening across the entire country. So I don't really think we have that kind of level of data here in comparison to what you're saying that you have in Canada. It just we don't have it. And I don't know whether it's people being like, it's a secrecy issue. We don't want people knowing that much about us, or whether it's people intentionally trying to obfuscate what's happening.
That's what I think is happening. I think
that's what I think too. But you can't say for sure that that's the case. And if you do, then people will say, you're conspiracy theorists, blah 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 blah. I don't want to even buy into that argument. I just want to be someone that has the most accurate information that I can possibly have, and that it's verifiable, and there's no way someone can say that I'm wrong.
Okay,
I just don't think I want to provide that.
For sure. Now, okay. What's releasing today in Australia?
So we have the federal budget coming out today.
I know, you've been excited about this.
Well, look, I'm not excited. I know it's going to be like, we're the greatest thing since sliced bread, because there's an election in May, and it's just gone April, so it'll probably be 40 or 50 days before the election. So they want to do something that makes it look like they care about poor people, because there's a lot more poor people now than what there used to be. And also it's very tough. It is hard. It's definitely harder to live now than what it was a decade ago.
Yeah. And it was easier 20 years ago and 30.
Oh, yeah. I think 30 years ago we were in a recession.
Oh, but Andrew, 30 years ago, all you needed was a decent job, and you'd still make it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, look, it's gone from making sure everyone gets an opportunity to making sure no one gets left behind. Like, does that make sense? Like, it's the language has changed around whether or not you have access to opportunities, rather than even if you do have the opportunity, you still can't get by.
So it's like robbing Peter to pay Paul.
Well, yeah, exactly. But that's what our government policy has been for the last, I don't
Ten-
even know how long. As long as I've been alive,
Wow.
it's always been that.
So what do you think is? So you believe this is going to be actually like your typical when they release the
Well,
typical?
I think they're going to say we're running a budget surplus, but to do so, they've had to cut back on a bunch of essential services, and to do that when you're about to go into a recession, like everyone knows there's going to be a recession here. All Treasury knows it. Most of the backbench knows it. The state MPs know it when I've spoken to them privately. Federal MPs kind of understand that it's the case. They don't really want to say anything about it. Like, everyone's hush-hush. Because the way the politics works in Australia is everyone assumes that the Liberal Party, the party that's currently in power, or the coalition, are better at economic management. Now, they say that, but they're also never in power when there's a recession. So, or not never, but it's very rarely has there been a time where they've been in power, there's been a recession. And I don't think that's a consequence of them being better managers. It's just they know when to get out. Like, they will do things to the detriment of their own party to ensure that they're not in power when things go to shit.
Yeah, so they're in a nice secluded place in Costa Rica.
Well, not even that. It's more like it's more like I know what you mean by, like the joke of, I'm just gonna be in my cabana or somewhere off in the middle of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
No, it's more like they know how to play the media to say this is going to be the case. Even though it's like saying you've run someone over and you've killed them, and then when the ambulance pronounces them dead, you say the ambulance didn't do any, they weren't doing their job, blah 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 blah, but you completely forget the person that's run them over in the first place.
Right. So it's like in here, like when I used to live in Vancouver, I would be standing in the lineup to get a coffee. Somebody would walk right in front of me in the lineup, and I would look at them and then say, "Well, I was sorry for me being here, I guess."
Yeah, exactly. But I think, like, again, the problem is because all the narrative in Australia has been, Labor's going to cause a recession. Labor's going to cause a recession. Blah blah blah. First of all, I haven't been in power in 6 years.
Mm-hmm.
Second of all, there's going to be a recession anyway. All the credit flows come from America, and we don't have any fiscal capability of getting around that. So,
do you
think you could have the second coming of Jesus in government at the moment, and there would still be a recession. It's just.
Well, yeah, of course. Well, yeah. It's been heading that way for the last 20 years anyway. So Andrew, in all honesty, is this stocks being pushed and commodities surging? Is this just a little blip or a flash in the pan? Are we going to see things come next week or early?
I think they'll probably do one budget surplus, and then there'll be another decade where they don't have one. Like, it'll be one of those fake outs where there's a surplus, and then for the next decade they're going to go, well, we can't run a surplus anymore because we're now in recession.
So where do you put the involvement of the Chinese markets? You put it around 40 to 50% in propping the Australian market, or is it more than 40-50%?
See, I don't know, because I don't trust the numbers coming out of our.
That's the problem. It's coming from a communist country.
No, but I don't even trust the numbers coming out of our own country, because there's very murky rules around what is and what isn't a foreign transaction. Like, you can buy through a trust that you're a beneficiary of. You could be a beneficiary and live in China, but also have 3 other people in that trust that are Australian, and all of a sudden it's a domestic purchase. So, like, there's ways to get around the foreign buyers laws here, and I'm sure they exist in Canada as well.
Right, for sure. Yeah. In Canada, they just launder money through here, nice and.
Well, yeah, we do it here as well.
Oh no! We're at $24 billion.
Yeah.
So that's a lot of cash, man. That's a lot of money.
Yeah. I think Vancouver is probably the money laundering capital through property and like through property at least. It's the money laundering capital
It
of the
is.
world.
And
But
Toronto's close by too.
I think Sydney and Melbourne are still very high up there in that regard as well, because you can get away with it. No one checks. No one really does the due diligence to make sure that what's going through. Like especially when it's cash purchases, no one checks. They only check when you're getting a loan.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the background, yeah. But in Canada, there was a couple of laws that if you're a foreign student, they don't do a background check and they don't need to verify income.
Yeah, yeah,
So there was all kinds of Mickey Mousing going on.
yeah. That happens all the time. Like you're never going to know every single loophole that exists, but the people that are applying for the property sure as hell will. Like they spend all their time doing that. That's all they do.
Okay,
Um,
Big W closures, 30 locations. How does that?
Yeah.
That's more private sector jobs and
well,
warehouses.
it's 16% of their locations are being closed.
Right.
Everyone's saying it's because they want to go digital, but is that also part of it? Is that their business model just doesn't work? Like to me, that's what that says more than anything else.
Consumer confidence. Do you see it going up in the next quarter?
No.
Consumer confidence. I think it's at one of its lowest levels. I think since 1975. But in your opinion, Andrew, do you see housing rebounding anytime soon?
Where? Are you talking about Australia?
In Sydney, Melbourne.
No.
Okay.
It's not going to rebound anytime soon.
Good.
You need to have the transaction volume would need to pick up pretty significantly from where it is for it to go up, and that's just not going to be the case. Like
their ace in the hole. The ace in the hole is first-time buyers.
Well, but first-time buyers can't even enter the market now. Like it's not even a question of like the prices might have gone down 10-15%, sure, but how much of income's moved? They've moved zero, and if it was unaffordable, like it was 50% over their budget before, it's still 35% over their budget now, having fallen 15%.
Right.
They still can't afford it. The only way they could have done it before is if they used parents' equity, and a lot of the lenders that were allowing people to use their parents' equity have now said that we're not going to allow you to get guarantor loans. So, any of the market advantage that they would have gotten from prices falling has been cut away from the fact that banks won't let them use their parents' equity anymore, which I think is smart. They shouldn't have let them in the first place. But again, it's how much is too little too late sort of thing.
Yeah. Okay,
we've been talking about this stuff for a while, and
so you're forecasting consumer confidence down, housing not rebounding. I believe that. Okay, I'll give you my little perspective on a world stage where things need to be still. Okay, Sydney 41% to go, Melbourne 39% to go, Auckland needs 58% to go, London 39% to go, Toronto 50% to go, Vancouver 62% to go, Seattle 31% to go, Los Angeles 59% to go. So a lot of these bigger cities
drop.
You're
talking about percentage to
go dropping in housing for a bit of yeah.
So is that for like a median house,
median house, like average house price, first time buyer's house?
Okay. See, I don't think it'll be as much as that. But
it has to, unless people make more. But the problem is, Andrew, in Vancouver, minimum wage is $11.25, and the average detached home is still $1.25 million.
Yeah, okay.
Like I'm talking about average.
Yes, you're talking about houses. Yeah, okay. That's not a first-time buyer house.
Okay. So first-time
buyer is not going to get into that market.
Okay, so first-time home buyers, I guess, won't buy homes anymore, so they'll go into the condo market where it's a cheaper.
Yeah.
It's a cheaper. But a one-bedroom is still. I mean.
Like if you're talking about first-home buyer apartments or first-home buyer dwellings. I don't think it's going to be that much of a fall because there's going to be buyers that are in that like higher end market that are going to have to go down and get relegated towards buying the lower priced property purely based on the fact that they don't have any other option.
Well,
So I think in the lower end, I think there'll be a little bit of support from people that have enough cash to buy cheaper sorts of things. Whether or not they choose to do that is going to be is still seen to will be seen. But in terms of your median house price, sure, I can see it falling 50%. There's no if buts or maybes about that.
well,
If
the
people
15%
aren't,
fall. Well, the 15% fall, Andrew, is enough to trigger a mass sell-off and a mass panic, because once you drop another 15 points, okay, arguably, let's say you're right, 15 points to go in Sydney. 15 points
at that point, you start having banks come in and being like, well, we're gonna do a constructive default on the loan that you've got so that we can claw back some of the money we want to get back now because we have liquidity issues. Because that's the thing that's going to end up happening. You'll have banks that have liquidity issues, and they won't be able to service the existing debts, and they'll have all these short-term debts that they have to try and service because they won't have enough people investing in the bank itself.
Right.
So instead of there being a question of whether or not the borrower was okay, it'll be a question of whether or not the bank is okay because they've taken out short-term debts that quickly default. If you issue a 30-year loan and then you have 3 month and 1 year short-term credit that you're using to make sure that the person can finance their variable rate mortgage, at what point can you just go, well, they can't refinance this and they can't service their existing debt, so they're going to have to default? That hasn't really been said, especially in a market where you're starting to get inversion in bond yields. Canada and America have already done that.
Right.
Their bond yields have already inverted. So I think it's just a matter of time before that happens here as well.
That's horrible for long-term investors.
Yeah, it's depending on how much debt you have. Mm-hmm. It could either be really good for you, it could be really bad for you. If you're a long-term debt investor, there's probably some scope for having 10-year plus bonds,
right?
Like treasuries and things like that. But again, it's whether or not it makes sense to do that when there's short-term shorts that make more sense. If that because you could buy 6-month puts or whatever, and all of a sudden you could be making 20% on the bond yield falling on the long-term treasuries, but all of a sudden the company goes to zero because you've picked all these shitty companies that shouldn't exist.
Right.
It's all going to be a trade-off for that. And then beyond that, it'll be a question of whether or not, there won't be that many people that have enough cash to even make that kind of decision, which is the really scary part to me.
That's exactly what the scary part is. Andrew, can I ask a question? Just a very basic question. Do you think this system is rigged against the ordinary Joe Donuts?
100% it is. Of course it is.
Okay, I just wanted to know what your point of view with that on that was. Now, this has been looming around, and I've been talking about this on the channel quite a bit, and I want to hear what you think. Are we going to start going to negative interest rates where they start confiscating our money? Are we going to remove the cashless?
I think yes. I think we are going to go into that situation. I think Cyprus is the trial run. New Zealand already has legislation for that. Australia has kind of got legislation for that. It's very murky what our definitions of instruments are. So when they start talking about being able to use instruments to ensure capital adequacy at banks, they don't describe what an instrument is. An instrument could be a deposit, it could be a hybrid bond, it could be equity. They haven't described what it is. So
exactly,
it's this very broad language that leaves that kind of window open. And I think this is the way our politics works in Australia, in a way that it doesn't work in other countries. You have to be able to infer what was meant by the legislation in order to be able to kind of protect yourself.
So when do you think?
Really shit.
So when do you think negative interest rates? I remember I made a video a few weeks back, and a lot of people said I was overreacting with this video, but I've been reading and looking at a lot of graphs and just kind of understanding and looking at the flows and liquidity and equity and all the different, the debt to person income. Right now, as sure as my name, that I believe that if Australia even went to 0% interest rates, they still couldn't fix their problem.
No, they can't. It'd have to be negative. I think, like, what's going to happen is one of the big four will end up being resolved at some point in time. That's going to have to happen because they can't keep doing what they're doing now. The only other way they'd be able to do that is if they start confiscating deposits. And even then, I don't think they'd be able to solve their problems.
Okay, because okay, I don't know if you're hearing this, but they're gearing towards negative interest rates in the EU, and the EU is slightly doing it now in a way where they're actually is buying government bonds again.
Yeah.
So
it's the same sort of thing. It's the what do you call it? They're doing quantitative easing. Well, they're going to have to do quantitative easing again because once you get to the point where you've got inverted bond yields, it's going to get to the point where people won't be able to service their short-term debt because they're not getting a high enough rate of return on their deposits. Because if you have a deposit in a 3-year fixed term account, and all of a sudden the 1-year bond yield goes higher than that, then you have to pay more on your short-term debt than what you're getting paid for holding a 3-year term deposit.
Yeah,
which is crazy. But again, that kind of conversation really needs to occur on a much broader scale than what it is at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
Like people don't really understand what the issue is with short-term bonds getting really expensive. Like it's like having a spike in inflation. Really, that's effectively like what is happening when you see that a bond yield inversion. It means that people expect there to be a bunch of risk in the short term.
Yeah,
like
but Andrew, this is a concept that's sweeping every English speaking country.
Yeah.
So it's not just in Australia; it's every English speaking country has pretty much put themselves in this position in the last 7 to 8 years.
Well, I think we've done it in the last 40 years, really. Like all of it.
Well, things got red hot in the last 10 years.
Pardon?
I think things got red hot in the last 10.
I think you just noticed it in the last 10, really.
Okay.
Like, it's more like the last kind of oomph out of the end of it rather than being, rather than not being present in previous points in time.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I see what you're saying. I just caught wind of it at that time because I was, I guess, awake at that time. Or I cared.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's more so also the fact that the data has become much more readily available in the last decade.
Yeah, okay, I guess you're right. I guess you're right. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to ask you. Like, I see us now, I'm not kidding, this next quarter and the quarter after, I see them building a third economic phony asset bubble on the second one and the first one.
What, in the next 6 months?
I don't know. I just see them finding ways to propping this up and keep it going.
Well, it'll be an extended pretend, basically.
Extended pretend. Kick the can down the road. Kick the can down the road. But we're building a third recovery or not recovery, but a third phony asset bubble now.
Yeah, I saw that with the Canadian government taking an equity stance in first home buyer.
That's a nightmare.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, like, okay, can I ask a question? I've wanted to ask you this question. I keep forgetting to ask you every time I speak to you.
Sure.
Remember when we artificially lowered rates to help bail out the banks?
Yeah.
Okay. My question is, was that technically an illegal move? Would that be illegal?
Well, it's not technically illegal.
Because we've never done it in human history, and we decided to go.
We have.
Okay.
We've done it a bunch of times in human history. Australia did it in the 1890s. The Roman Empire did it in...
Yeah, they adding different metals to
AD.
their gold. I know. But I'm talking about, like... Okay, we haven't done it in...
You're talking about a bailout. It's happened a bunch of times. We did. Also, it was in Australia's a bail in, not a bail out. But in the Roman times, they did the same thing. They did the quantitative easing in 33 AD in the Roman Empire, but it was primarily in Rome itself, but it affected the entire empire.
Exactly.
So it has happened in human history. It's just a really long time ago.
Right. But
because we
okay.
have very short memories.
Well, we both agree that this is all trash for cash. But what I'm saying is, what makes it different now? It's become more of a revolving door between government and corporate companies.
Yeah. Well, there's definitely corporate influence to the point where you can't really tell whether it's a corporation or a government that's running things.
Because
Which is like even the SNC Lavalin thing. Like normally you would see politicians' heads roll over that, and there just hasn't been that kind of like. There's been a push for it, but it hasn't really been the same as like if you were to see someone that's obviously involved in a government cover up, which that was. Like normally they'd be gone. You wouldn't even have a question about it. Like we had a guy in Australia that was kicked out of government for I think it was like $2,000 worth of donations from a Chinese sponsor, and then he said that there were like differences between him on government policy and China, and like that happens all the time.
mm-hmm.
But what you have a private company in Canada that employs 10,000 people or something like that, and they bribe the Libyan government to try and get contracts, and nothing happens to them. Like it's ridiculous.
But if me and you did that, we'd get kicked in the head and thrown in a prison cell and unheard of.
We'd be in
I am Max Kaiser.
Like that's where we'd be.
I just turned on the Kaiser report here. I got it open here, and
Yeah.
I follow Kaiser once in a while. And he's got the yield curve. So if you guys want to hear more about the yield curve, we got Max Kaiser here. He just did a Kaiser report, episode 1364. He discusses the yield curve inverting normally signals a recession, but the service sector is booming. Meanwhile, the budget deficit is exploding as the government free for all ratchets up. Max also interviews. So this is a really good video, guys. I prompt you to watch this video. Sorry, I just turned it on in the background while you were talking. Andrew, sorry.
That's all right.
But this is a good one. And I think everyone should tune into this video because he goes into some good... what I like the most about Max Kaiser is because he talks more at a street level.
Yeah.
So he could reach everybody, so everybody knows what's going on.
Yeah, I find myself having problems doing that, but I think having the conversation with you where I have to explain what I'm talking about really does help with that.
Yeah,
because I think you're a lot better at that than what I am.
Yeah, I'm more of a street guy. You know what I'm saying? I'm more of a. I have no education, but I do see that things are not going right, and I am very.
Yeah, but I think you have enough common sense to be able to say this doesn't make sense.
Yes, it's regurgitation. I don't regurgitate books and what books tell us. What I just look at what the situation is, assess it, and say, hey man, this ain't good.
Yeah.
So I look into it. I talk to the right people, and we start talking about it.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's how it starts. And there's a couple of thousand people going to be watching this transmission in the next couple hours. So, yeah. Anyways, Andrew, anything else you want to say? Anything else you want to leave with?
Mostly that I hope we're smart enough to figure out that there's more to running a country than making sure that you put some money in the back pocket or run a surplus. I really hope that they put their priorities somewhere else rather than pushing everything into the private sector, because eventually you do need government to step in some areas. Like you can't get away with just saying, "Oh, that's someone else's problem" forever, because when you do that, there's an implicit guarantee for some people, and then there's poverty for everyone else. Like if say
the
for
masses.
example, if there's a homeless person that says, "Oh, I've just lost my house. I need a government bailout for you to make sure I don't lose my house," everyone would laugh at them, right? But if that happens on an international scale, when a massive bank does the same thing, it's treated as a given that they're going to be bailed out.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, Andrew, Mr. Senior Baker, it's an absolute pleasure having you on the show today and give us a little bit of insight. And maybe next week we'll get back together if you get some time. We could talk about, what's going on in that report that comes out today. I know you know what's coming.
Do that.
Huh?
We'll definitely do that.
Oh, I know you know what they're going to tell us already, but let's debunk some of it.
I'm not going to put words in their mouth. I'll wait for them to say it before I comment.
Well, yeah. We were talking about this earlier. We have somewhat of a general idea of what they want to tell people, but what is really happening, I don't know. Anyways, we'll talk about this sometime next week, and we'll go over it, and we'll maybe work on debunking this.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
We'll point out where the issues are.
Exactly. And then maybe we get some conversation going about how to fix these problems.
Yeah, definitely. That sounds really good to me.
Okay, Andrew, you take care now, okay? You have a good one.
I will. You too.
Okay.
All right.
Good night. All right, people, that's Andrew Baker from Sydney, Australia. A top-of-the-line economic expert, man. Knows the flow of things. And, sometimes I jump in the conversation and interrupt just so everybody is on the same page and understanding where we're going with this, or giving my little insight of what how I'm seeing it. If I'm seeing it wrong, he could correct me, Anyways, guys, thanks for watching, and let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and we'll have him on, probably on Mike in the Night sometime. We'll probably do maybe a financial fallout episode of massive financial fallout and the mass economic deception we're seeing right now. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe button.